Imagine this. You are Gaius, a 20-year-old Gaul captured during Caesar's campaigns, and you're standing in the suffocating darkness beneath the Colosseum. The stone walls weep with moisture and the stench of death. Above you, 50,000 Romans scream for blood, while you clutch a rusted gladius with trembling hands. The metal grate above your head creaks open, flooding your cell with blinding sunlight and the deafening roar of the crowd. Your heart pounds against your ribs as you realize this might be your last moment of consciousness. What you don't know is that the arena floor you're about to step onto is soaked with the blood of thousands who stood exactly where you stand now. Men who discovered that survival in the Colosseum required more than fighting skill. It demanded a willingness to do things that would shatter your soul long before any sword could touch your body. You're about to learn that everything you thought you knew about gladiatorial combat is a lie. The Hollywood version of noble warriors dying with honor is a fantasy. The real Colosseum was a factory of psychological destruction where slaves didn't just fight for their lives. They competed to see who could degrade themselves most creatively for the entertainment of their masters. What they did to survive would make modern prisoners of war look like they were on vacation. The truth about gladiator survival makes death in the arena seem like mercy compared to what the living endured. You think you understand desperation. You're about to discover horrors that will make you grateful for every freedom you've ever taken for granted. Before we dive deeper into these buried stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's darkest corners. The gladiator schools of Rome weren't training facilities. They were systematic dehumanization camps designed to break every aspect of human dignity before sending slaves into the arena. When you were sold to a lanista, the gladiator trainer, you ceased to exist as a person and became a piece of entertainment equipment that happened to breathe. Your new life began with the ritualistic stripping away of your identity. Your name was replaced with a number carved into your arm with a hot iron. Your hair was shaved completely, removing any trace of your tribal or cultural identity. You were given a leather collar with bronze plates that identified your owner, your fighting category, and your expected lifespan, measured not in years but in scheduled arena appearances. The living conditions in gladiator schools were designed to create the perfect combination of physical conditioning and psychological desperation. You shared a cell barely 6 feet square with 3 other men, sleeping on stone benches with no covering. The cell had no window, no privacy, and a single hole in the floor for waste that was emptied once per week. Your daily routine was regulated with military precision, but focused entirely on preparing you to kill or be killed for public entertainment. You woke before dawn to the sound of whips cracking against stone walls. Breakfast was a thin gruel made from barley and sometimes containing meat scraps, though you learned not to ask what animal they came from. Training began immediately after the meager meal and continued until sunset with only brief breaks for water. But this wasn't athletic training designed to build champions. It was conditioning designed to turn you into a killing machine that could provide maximum entertainment value before your inevitable death. The trainers weren't coaches. They were artisans of violence who understood exactly how to modify human behavior through pain and reward. They studied you constantly, learning your fears, your attachments, your weaknesses, and then systematically use that knowledge to control every aspect of your existence. Physical training was brutal beyond anything you could imagine. You spent hours learning to fight with weapons designed not for efficiency, but for spectacle. The gladius was heavy and awkward, chosen because it forced close combat that let the crowd see blood spray across the sand. The net and trident combination required elaborate choreography that made fights last longer and gave audiences multiple opportunities to see victims suffer. Weapons training included learning to wound without killing, to prolong suffering for crowd entertainment, and to perform elaborate death scenes that satisfied bloodthirsty spectators. You practiced falling dramatically, crying out in pain convincingly, and begging for mercy in ways that would excite rather than disgust the audience. But the physical training was nothing compared to the psychological conditioning that transformed proud warriors into desperate performers willing to do anything to survive another day. The trainers discovered that traditional torture produced broken slaves who died quickly in the arena. Instead, they developed sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation that kept gladiators functional while destroying their sense of self-worth. The first technique was systematic humiliation designed to break down any remaining dignity. You were forced to perform degrading acts in front of other slaves, creating a community of shared shame that prevented solidarity. These acts started small, like being forced to crawl on your belly for food, but escalated to intimate degradations that left permanent psychological scars. Sexual humiliation was a constant tool of control. Male gladiators were forced to submit to trainers and wealthy patrons as payment for better equipment, medical care, or simply the chance to avoid the worst training punishments. This wasn't occasional abuse. It was systematized prostitution where your body became currency in an economy of survival. Women gladiators, though less common, faced even worse exploitation. They were expected to provide entertainment for private parties before and after their arena appearances, often fighting nude or in revealing costumes designed to titillate rather than protect. Their training included not just combat skills but performance techniques designed to arouse and satisfy wealthy patrons who paid extra for private gladiator shows. The ludus, or gladiator school, operated like a twisted marketplace where human suffering was packaged and sold to the highest bidder. Wealthy Romans could purchase private training sessions where they fought against chained gladiators who weren't allowed to defend themselves effectively. These sessions allowed rich citizens to experience the thrill of gladiatorial combat without any real risk, while slaves absorbed injuries that would affect their performance in actual arena contests. Trainers sold access to popular gladiators for private parties, where slaves were forced to fight in entertainment battles that often resulted in serious injuries or death. These private fights weren't regulated like public arena contests, meaning gladiators could be killed or maimed for the amusement of dinner party guests without any oversight or compensation to their owners. The medical care provided to gladiators reveals the purely economic nature of their treatment. Injuries were treated not to preserve human life but to maintain the value of expensive entertainment property. Gladiators with crowd appeal received sophisticated medical attention that could heal wounds and keep them fighting for years. Popular fighters had access to skilled physicians, pain-relieving drugs, and even primitive surgical procedures. But gladiators who failed to entertain or showed poor fighting skills received minimal medical care that often resulted in infection, permanent disability, or death from treatable injuries. The message was clear. Your value as a human being was directly tied to your ability to provide entertaining violence for Roman audiences. The trainers developed elaborate ranking systems that created competition among slaves for basic necessities like food, medical care, and sleeping arrangements. Higher-ranked gladiators received better treatment, but maintaining rank required not just fighting skill, but willingness to participate in the degradation of lower-ranked slaves. This system prevented solidarity among gladiators by making survival dependent on stepping on others rather than working together. You learned that helping a fellow slave might cost you the favor points you needed to avoid punishment or death. The psychological pressure to betray others for personal survival created a community of broken individuals who couldn't trust anyone. The economic realities of gladiator ownership meant that slaves were literally gambling with their lives in ways that had nothing to do with fighting ability. Gladiator schools operated on thin profit margins that depended on maximizing the entertainment value of each slave while minimizing training and maintenance costs. This economic pressure created a situation where gladiators had to constantly prove their worth not just as fighters, but as entertainers willing to do whatever crowds demanded. Survival often depended on developing signature performance techniques that made you memorable to audiences and valuable to promoters. Some gladiators specialized in elaborate death scenes that earned applause even in defeat. Others developed distinctive fighting styles that prolonged combat and increased crowd excitement. The most successful gladiators learned to read audience moods and adjust their performance accordingly, fighting aggressively when crowds wanted violence and dramatically when they wanted spectacle. But here's where gladiator survival becomes truly horrifying. The arena itself was designed as a theater of psychological torture, where the actual fighting was only one element of a larger entertainment complex built around human suffering. The elaborate underground chambers beneath the Colosseum contained more than holding cells and animal cages. They housed a complete infrastructure dedicated to manufacturing terror for public consumption. The Hypogum, the underground area beneath the arena floor, was a maze of corridors, chambers, and mechanical devices designed to create maximum fear and confusion. Gladiators weren't just sent up to fight, they were subjected to elaborate psychological warfare designed to break their mental resistance before combat even began. One of the most terrifying features was the system of randomly opening floor traps that could dump gladiators into chambers filled with wild animals, boiling water, or simply deep pits where they would slowly starve. These traps weren't used in every fight, but the knowledge that the floor beneath your feet could open at any moment created constant psychological pressure that affected every movement and decision. The sound system in the Hypogum was designed to amplify and distort noises in ways that created maximum terror. The roar of the crowd above was mixed with artificial sounds, screams from previous fights, animal growls, and mechanical noises that suggested unknown horrors waiting in the shadows. Gladiators often entered the arena already psychologically broken by hours of listening to carefully orchestrated soundscapes of fear. Lighting in the underground chambers was deliberately manipulated to create disorientation and terror. Torches were placed to cast moving shadows that suggested threats that weren't actually there. Mirrors were positioned to create confusing reflections that made it impossible to judge distance or direction accurately. By the time gladiators reached the arena floor, many were already experiencing symptoms of severe psychological trauma. The staging areas where gladiators waited before fights were designed as miniature torture chambers. Holding cells were deliberately overcrowded, forcing slaves to compete for basic space to sit or lie down. The walls were covered with graffiti from previous gladiators. Last messages, prayers, and detailed descriptions of deaths that awaited newcomers. Food and water in the staging areas were deliberately contaminated with mild toxins that caused nausea, diarrhea, and weakness without causing obvious illness. This ensured that gladiators entered combat already physically compromised while appearing healthy enough to provide entertaining fights. The pre-fight rituals were carefully designed psychological operations that broke down mental resistance while building crowd excitement. Gladiators were forced to parade around the arena wearing elaborate costumes that mocked their cultural origins and emphasized their status as exotic entertainment for Roman superiority. These parades weren't simple processions. They were humiliation ceremonies where slaves had to perform degrading acts for crowd amusement. Some gladiators were forced to dance in ways that mocked their native cultures. Others had to recite prepared speeches that praised Roman superiority while denigrating their own peoples and families. The oath ceremony, where gladiators swore to fight to the death, was performed with deliberate theatrical cruelty. Slaves had to kneel before the editor, the game's sponsor, and loudly proclaim their willingness to die for Roman entertainment. This ceremony was designed to break any remaining psychological resistance while demonstrating Roman power over conquered peoples. But the true horror of gladiator survival reveals itself in the elaborate gaming systems that surrounded arena combat. The fights themselves were often predetermined in ways that allowed wealthy Romans to bet on specific outcomes while ensuring maximum entertainment value from each slave's death. Gladiators who showed fighting skill weren't rewarded with better chances of survival. They were assigned more difficult opponents and more elaborate death scenarios that would provide greater spectacle for paying audiences. Success in combat often meant being selected for special exhibitions designed to showcase specific types of violence or exotic killing methods. The most popular gladiators weren't those who won fights, but those who provided the most entertaining deaths. Crowd favorites were often deliberately matched against superior opponents in scenarios designed to produce dramatic defeats that would satisfy audience bloodlust while eliminating slaves who had become too expensive to maintain. Match fixing was common and elaborate, with complex betting systems that allowed wealthy Romans to profit from human suffering, while ensuring that popular fighters died in ways that provided maximum entertainment value. Gladiators learned that winning too often or too easily could result in being assigned suicide missions disguised as fair fights. The psychological pressure of this system was devastating. Gladiators had to balance fighting well enough to survive immediate threats while avoiding success that would mark them for elimination. Many developed elaborate strategies for losing convincingly without actually dying, performing defeat so skillfully that crowds were satisfied while they survived to fight another day. These survival strategies often required gladiators to inflict serious injuries on themselves to create convincing blood and trauma without actually suffering fatal wounds. Some became expert at using razor-sharp fragments hidden in their equipment to create dramatic-looking cuts that bled profusely but missed vital organs. Others learned to fake serious injuries through elaborate performance techniques that convinced both audiences and officials that they were more badly wounded than they actually were. The most skilled survival artists could simulate mortal wounds so convincingly that they were carried from the arena and later nursed back to health in secret recovery chambers. But survival through deception required constant vigilance and perfect timing. Officials who discovered gladiators faking deaths faced immediate execution, usually in front of crowds who had been cheated of authentic entertainment. The penalty for survival deception was being fed alive to wild animals in special punishment exhibitions. The animal hunts that preceded gladiator fights created additional survival challenges that went far beyond simply avoiding being eaten by lions. The venatio, or beast hunt, was a complex entertainment program that required human participants to perform elaborate scenarios of predation and death for crowd amusement. Condemned criminals and slaves designated for animal execution weren't simply thrown to wild beasts. They were forced to participate in elaborate theatrical productions that recreated mythological scenes or historical events. These productions required victims to follow specific scripts that prolonged their suffering while ensuring that their deaths provided maximum entertainment value. Some condemned slaves were dressed as mythological figures and forced to recreate famous death scenes from classical literature. Others had to perform as historical characters whose defeats symbolized Roman triumph over barbarian peoples. The scripts for these performances were detailed and demanding, requiring victims to deliver lines and perform actions even while being attacked by dangerous animals. The training for these animal performances was almost as terrifying as the actual events. Slaves designated for beast hunts were taught to move and react in ways that would provide optimal viewing for arena audiences. They learned to fall dramatically when attacked, to scream in ways that carried to the upper seats, and to position their bodies so that their wounds would be visible to spectators throughout the arena. But here's what makes animal hunt survival truly horrifying. Some slaves developed techniques for surviving encounters with wild beasts by learning to work with animal trainers and handlers who controlled the timing and intensity of attacks. This collaboration required slaves to participate in the torture and death of other humans while hoping to earn protection for themselves. Animal handlers could signal beasts to attack more or less aggressively, target specific body parts, or even call off attacks entirely in exchange for payments or favors from gladiators who had acquired money or valuable items. This created a secondary economy of survival where human lives were traded for temporary protection from animal attacks. The most desperate gladiators entered into agreements where they would help handlers torture other slaves in exchange for being given weapons or protective equipment during their own animal encounters. These arrangements required participants to actively facilitate the suffering of fellow slaves while knowing that their own turn would come eventually. Some gladiators specialized in animal handling skills that made them valuable enough to keep alive as assistants in beast hunts. These slaves learned to train predators, maintain exotic animals, and coordinate complex attack scenarios that required precise timing and animal behavior control. But animal handling survival came with its own horrors. Handler gladiators were expected to participate in the torture and execution of other humans as part of their regular duties. They fed condemned prisoners to animals, cleaned up human remains after attacks, and maintained the psychological conditioning of beasts used for human execution. The specialized equipment used in animal hunts reveals the deliberate cruelty built into these entertainments. Victims weren't simply released into arenas with animals. They were provided with elaborate but useless weapons designed to create the illusion of fair combat while ensuring that resistance would be futile. Some condemned slaves were given wooden swords while facing armed gladiators who were secretly working with animal handlers. Others received damaged or deliberately weakened weapons that would break at critical moments, leaving them defenseless against beast attacks that had been carefully choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. The costumes worn by beast hunt victims were designed to restrict movement while creating visual spectacle. Heavy, elaborate outfits made it impossible to run effectively while ensuring that attacks would produce dramatic falls and theatrical death scenes that satisfied audience expectations for entertaining executions. But beyond the physical horrors of gladiator life lay an even more devastating reality: the complete destruction of human relationships and emotional connections that survival in the arena required. The psychological techniques used to control gladiators were designed to isolate slaves from any source of emotional support or human connection that might provide strength to resist or rebel. Family relationships were systematically destroyed through techniques that forced gladiators to compete against relatives or watch family members suffer punishments for their failures in the arena. Fathers were sometimes forced to fight their own sons, with the winner earning temporary survival while the loser faced immediate execution. Romantic relationships between gladiators were discovered and exploited by trainers who used emotional attachments as leverage for controlling behavior. Couples who formed bonds in gladiator schools found their relationships weaponized against them, with each partner's survival depending on their willingness to harm or betray the other. The most psychologically devastating technique was forcing gladiators to participate in the torture and execution of friends and allies as proof of their complete submission to Roman authority. These loyalty tests eliminated any possibility of solidarity or mutual support among slaves while demonstrating the absolute power of their owners to control every aspect of their existence. Gladiators who developed close friendships found those relationships turned into sources of constant terror rather than comfort. Your survival might depend on your willingness to inform on friends who violated rules, participated in escape attempts, or showed signs of planning rebellion. The training programs deliberately created artificial conflicts and competitions between slaves who might otherwise form alliances. Gladiators were forced to compete for basic necessities like food, water, medical care, and sleeping space in ways that made cooperation impossible and betrayal necessary for survival. These competition systems were designed to prevent the formation of group identity or shared resistance that might threaten the profitability of gladiator schools. Slaves learned that individual survival required constant vigilance against other slaves who represented threats to their own minimal security and comfort. The result was a community of broken individuals who couldn't trust anyone, couldn't form meaningful relationships, and couldn't imagine any future beyond their next arena appearance. The psychological isolation was so complete that many gladiators lost the ability to connect with other human beings, even when opportunities for genuine friendship presented themselves. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of gladiator survival was the way the system gradually convinced slaves that their dehumanization was not only necessary, but morally justified. Through constant repetition of propaganda that portrayed gladiators as criminals who deserved punishment, or barbarians who needed civilizing through Roman discipline, many slaves began to internalize beliefs about their own worthlessness. The daily rituals of gladiator life included forced recitation of phrases that reinforced slave status and Roman superiority. Gladiators had to begin each day by loudly proclaiming their gratitude for the opportunity to serve Rome through their deaths, their acknowledgement that their lives belonged entirely to their owners, and their understanding that survival was a privilege that had to be earned through entertaining performance. These psychological conditioning techniques were so effective that many gladiators developed genuine loyalty to their owners and pride in their ability to provide quality entertainment for Roman audiences. Stockholm Syndrome was systematically cultivated through training programs that rewarded submission while punishing any sign of independence or self-respect. The most successful gladiators, Those who survived multiple arena appearances often became enthusiastic participants in the system that enslaved them. They served as trainers for new slaves, enforcers of discipline in gladiator schools, and even agents who helped capture escaped slaves or identify potential rebels. This psychological transformation was the ultimate victory of the Roman system, turning victims into willing participants who identified their own survival with the continuation of their oppression. Gladiators who achieved this level of psychological submission were sometimes rewarded with minor privileges or responsibilities that created the illusion of advancement within a system designed to destroy them. The few gladiators who achieved their freedom through exceptional service or crowd appeal often remained psychologically dependent on their former owners and the gladiatorial system that had defined their entire adult lives. Freedom meant losing the only identity and social structure they had known, leaving them unable to function in normal Roman society. Many freed gladiators voluntarily returned to arena life because they couldn't cope with the psychological challenges of independent existence. The conditioning they had experienced was so thorough that freedom felt more threatening than slavery, independence more terrifying than submission. The long-term psychological damage inflicted on gladiator survivors was profound and permanent. Those who lived long enough to be freed often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, and an inability to form normal human relationships. Former gladiators frequently experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks triggered by sounds, smells, or sights that reminded them of arena combat. Many developed substance abuse problems as they attempted to self-medicate the psychological pain that freedom couldn't heal. The social isolation experienced by freed gladiators was almost as devastating as their previous enslavement. Roman society viewed former arena fighters as contaminated by their association with violence and death, making it nearly impossible for them to integrate into normal communities or establish legitimate businesses and relationships. Most freed gladiators ended up working in occupations that exploited their combat skills but kept them socially marginalized, as bodyguards for wealthy families, trainers in gladiator schools, or enforcers for criminal organizations. Very few ever escaped the world of violence that had defined their slave years. The economic impact of gladiatorial combat extended far beyond the immediate profits generated by arena entertainments. The system created entire industries built around human suffering that employed thousands of Romans and generated enormous wealth for investors and entrepreneurs. Gladiator schools operated like modern sports franchises, with complex ownership structures, merchandising operations, and media tie-ins that maximized profits from slave labor. Popular gladiators were marketed like celebrity athletes, with their images sold on pottery, jewelry, and household items throughout the empire. The betting industry surrounding gladiatorial combat was massive and sophisticated, with organized gambling operations that took wagers on everything from individual fight outcomes to specific types of injuries that would occur during matches. These betting operations were often rigged in favor of wealthy insiders who had advanced knowledge of match outcomes. Medical innovations developed to keep gladiators alive and fighting longer were later applied to military medicine and general health care, meaning that Roman medical advances were literally built on techniques for prolonging human suffering for entertainment purposes. The gladiatorial system contributed to medical knowledge through systematic torture and experimentation on human subjects. The training techniques developed for gladiators influenced military instruction throughout the Roman army, spreading methods of psychological conditioning and violence training that made Roman legions more effective at conquest and control. The brutality that characterized gladiatorial combat became embedded in Roman military culture and imperial administration. But perhaps most significantly, the normalization of extreme violence for entertainment created cultural attitudes that made Romans more accepting of brutality in other contexts. Citizens who enjoyed watching humans torn apart by animals for fun were less likely to object to similar treatment of conquered peoples or political dissidents. The gladiatorial system wasn't just entertainment. It was a tool of social control that taught Romans to associate violence with pleasure and suffering with justice. The psychological impact on audiences was as significant as the impact on gladiators themselves, creating a society that celebrated cruelty and viewed human life as expendable for the amusement of those with power. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries reveals the true extent of injuries and trauma experienced by arena fighters. Skeletal remains show evidence of multiple severe injuries that had healed, indicating that gladiators fought numerous times while carrying permanent damage from previous combat. The bone evidence also reveals the sophisticated medical care provided to valuable gladiators, with complex surgical procedures and healing techniques that kept fighters alive despite injuries that would have killed ordinary people. This medical attention wasn't motivated by humanitarianism, but by economic necessity to protect valuable entertainment investments. Analysis of gladiator remains shows evidence of nutritional deficiencies and chronic health problems caused by the stress and deprivation of gladiator school life. Despite being valuable property, gladiators were maintained at minimal cost that preserved fighting ability while ignoring general health and well-being. The discovery of gladiator burial grounds has also revealed evidence of ritual practices surrounding the deaths of arena fighters. Some gladiators were buried with weapons or personal items, suggesting that they had achieved some degree of respect or affection from their owners despite their slave status. But the majority of gladiator remains show evidence of hasty mass burial practices that treated dead fighters like garbage to be disposed of efficiently rather than human beings deserving dignified treatment. Most gladiators ended their lives in unmarked graves shared with arena arena casualties and refuse from gladiatorial events. The transformation of gladiatorial combat from Roman Republic public funeral games into imperial entertainment spectacles reflects broader changes in Roman society that made systematic brutality more acceptable and institutionalized. Early gladiator fights were relatively small affairs connected to religious observances and family honor. But as Rome conquered more territory and enslaved more people, gladiatorial combat evolved into an industry designed to process enormous numbers of human beings through systematic degradation and death for public amusement. The scale of suffering increased exponentially as the Roman Empire expanded its capacity for organized violence. The Colosseum itself represents the pinnacle of technological innovation applied to human suffering. Its complex mechanical systems, elaborate staging capabilities, and sophisticated crowd control features were engineering marvels designed specifically to maximize the efficiency of mass entertainment built around torture and execution. The fact that Romans invested enormous resources in perfecting the technology of public brutality reveals the central importance of systematic violence in imperial culture. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a machine for converting human lives into political spectacle and economic profit. The decline of gladiatorial combat came not from moral awakening, but from economic and military pressures that made the system unsustainable. As the empire faced increasing external threats and internal instability, the resources required to maintain elaborate entertainment spectacles became too expensive to justify. The rise of Christianity provided ideological justification for ending gladiatorial games, but the practical motivations were primarily financial and military. The empire needed soldiers more than it needed entertainment, and resources that had been devoted to arena spectacles were redirected to border defense and internal security. The last gladiatorial games were held in the early 5th century, ending a tradition that had lasted for over 600 years and had consumed hundreds of thousands of human lives for the entertainment of Roman audiences. The end of gladiatorial combat marked the conclusion of one of history's most systematic programs of state-sponsored torture and execution for public amusement. But the legacy of the gladiatorial system extends far beyond its historical period. The Roman model of transforming human suffering into public entertainment established patterns of spectacle and violence that have influenced cultures throughout history and continue to shape modern attitudes toward brutality and power. The psychological techniques developed for controlling gladiators, systematic dehumanization, competitive isolation, and the destruction of human relationships have been employed by totalitarian regimes and criminal organizations throughout history. The Roman innovations in applied psychology for social control became templates for oppression that persist in various forms today. The normalization of extreme violence for entertainment that characterized Roman gladiatorial culture has parallels in modern media, sports, and political spectacle that celebrate brutality and encourage audiences to enjoy the suffering of others. The Roman legacy reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains present in human societies and requires constant vigilance to prevent its resurgence. Understanding the true nature of gladiatorial survival, the psychological torture, sexual exploitation, systematic dehumanization, and complete destruction of human dignity helps us recognize similar patterns in contemporary context and resist the cultural forces that make extreme violence acceptable when it's packaged as entertainment or justified as necessary for social order. The gladiators who died in Roman arenas were real people with names, families, dreams, and fears, who found themselves trapped in a system designed to extract maximum entertainment value from their suffering and death. Their experiences remind us that behind every historical spectacle of violence were individual human beings whose pain and terror were genuine, regardless of the distance of time and culture. These forgotten voices deserve to be remembered not as exotic historical curiosities, but as victims of systematic oppression, whose experiences illuminate the dangers of societies that celebrate brutality and treat human life as expendable for the amusement of those with power. The next time you watch any form of combat sports or violent entertainment, remember the gladiators who discovered that survival often required betraying friends, degrading themselves, and participating in the torture of others. Their stories remind us that the price of entertainment built on human suffering is always higher than we're willing to admit. The young Gaul who stood trembling in the darkness beneath the Colosseum 2,000 years ago faced choices that no human being should ever have to make. His desperation and terror echo through history as a warning about the consequences of creating societies where human dignity becomes a luxury that only the powerful can afford. If this exploration into the shadows of human experience has opened your eyes to hidden truths about the past, subscribe to continue this journey together through history's darkest corners. There are countless more stories buried in time's archives, waiting for someone willing to listen to voices that were silenced by those who benefited from their suffering. These testimonies of survival remind us why understanding the full spectrum of human experience, both its capacity for cruelty and its potential for resistance, remains essential for creating a world where such systematic brutality never again becomes acceptable entertainment.